Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and I'm going to exercise a little my agency over the structure, and I'm going to give it to our external guest speaker first. So Dominik Zaum from the University of Reading will begin with ownership discourses in state building.
Great. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation. I think a kind of a health warning ahead. This is by no means a kind of finished paper that I'm presenting. It's something I've been working on and off for the last year or so, and it's really just putting together a range of thoughts around the issue of local ownership and the kind of critical examination of local ownership, and with the hope of getting some feedback on this. And local ownership has very much become the new orthodoxy of state building. I mean, you can't open a donor document without it jumping at you. It's in the OECD state building paper that was mentioned earlier. The UN DPKO's capstone doctrine has a very prominent discussion of state building. And fundamentally, every donor sincerely expresses their strong support for the importance of local ownership. And of course, intuitively, everybody agrees to its importance, and I think it came out of the earlier debate. But actually, its real impact on state, as well as peace-building efforts, has been barely explored. And the purpose of this paper is not really to provide evidence for or against, but to really engage with some of the conceptual issues around local ownership. And what I want to suggest in these very brief comments is that most discussions of local ownership fail to disaggregate the local and pay little attention to local power structures and dynamics. And what I suggest about the implications of local ownership of state-building processes is fundamentally unsupported by much evidence. Local ownership is mostly seen as transforming the relationship between international and local actors and try to resolve some of the power asymmetries in this relationship. But arguably there's also, and that's really how it is mostly treated in much of the both literature, but also in particular kind of political peace-building literature, or state-building literature, but also in much of the donor literature. But I think there's arguably a much more far-reaching implication that a local ownership, if it were properly implemented and exercised, would have for social relationships within conflict-affected societies, in particular between elites and non-elites. But this is really hardly explored in the context of the literature. So what I want to do is three things: briefly examine the concept of local ownership, then examine the claims made about its impact and why it has become what I call the new orthodoxy, and then briefly explore what I think are the key problems, and that is that the debate doesn't engage with the problem of power in post-conflict states, and by drawing on some of the wider political economy literature, suggest some of the problems that this poses. If you look at the concept of local ownership, it has actually been filled with some meaning in, over the last 5 to 10 years. If you look at the initial conceptualizations of local ownership, it was effectively treating ownership as the acceptance of local actors of responsibility for implementing donor prescriptions. So in 2002, the IMF notably defined local ownership as, and I quote, the willing assumption of responsibility for an agreed program of policies by officials in a borrowing country who have the responsibility to formulate and carry out those policies. Based on an understanding that the program is achievable in the country's own interest. So the main implication of such an understanding is really, or was that ownership was really the local elite's willingness to defend the implications of an internationally designed donor program against possible internal detractors. And it's based on a highly technocratic and highly personalistic understanding of international actors' abilities to identify what is in the best interest of political community subject to their proposed policies. We've really moved on from this, and it's quite dramatically changed in recent years. If you look at policy and practice statements of donors now, be it the OECD, that kind of summarizes much of this, be it DFID, be it the World Bank, they very much emphasize the participation or even leadership of local actors in the design, management, and implementation of policies. Now, to what extent practice reflects these laudable words and aims is a completely different question. The question here is really what are, even if we take it as face value, what are the consequences and implications of this? Importantly, such an understanding of local ownership has potentially far more radical implications. It is seen as inherently transformative of social relations by empowering otherwise marginalized groups, giving them a voice in state-building and reconstruction processes, and involving them in its implementation. And as I said, it potentially affects two distinct social relations, both between local and international actors, to address the problem of power asymmetries between them, but also between the relationships within the political community between elites and non-elites, as well as horizontally between different communities. Now, what are the rationales for promoting local ownership? The first is a normative commitment to self-determination. If state-building policies are seen as having local ownership, then one could argue the objectives of external intervention can at least in principle be reconciled with the norms of sovereignty and self-government. Thus, local ownership is seen as implying local consent and seen as helping to legitimize outside intervention. And I think one way, which I'm not going to explore now, but we can go into the discussion, is actually seeing the whole local ownership discourse as a way of legitimating interventions. The second, and I think that's the more interesting one, and I want to explore a bit more today, is the kind of consequentialist argument about local ownership, that it makes for more effective and sustainable state-building interventions. Thus, Amatafazioni suggests that, and I quote, the more external power allows local people to work things out amongst themselves, even if the emerging patterns of exactly the way things are done in a home country do not neatly fit into a master plan, the more likely the new regimes are to develop. Now, broadly, this intuition rests on four causal claims. The first one is that to be sustainable and to command compliance, institutions need to reflect relevant social norms. Otherwise, they'll be brittle and unsustainable in the absence of coercion or continued external support. And local ownership is seen as a way of ensuring this fit of institutions to broader social norms. Secondly, local ownership is said to help international state builders to draw on local practical knowledge, what James Scott calls metis, which complements the abstract technical knowledge of outsiders. So to understand what works and doesn't work in a specific context and to match institutions to local resources. So you don't build as an team or a judiciary that cannot be financed. And the third rationale causal claim is that the involvement of local actors into the design of the implementation of state-building policies is said to help to build local capacity rather than bypassing and weakening it. So this is the claim, for example, many practitioners or kind of scholar practitioners like Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart make, who argue that by bypassing the state, by building these parallel bureaucracies of donors and implementation mechanisms and funneling money through them, you suck out capacity rather than build it. And finally, drawing on Hirschman's terminology of exit and voice, local ownership is seen as giving voice to different local groups and thus preventing their exit from a state or peace-building process. By giving them a role and a voice in that process, this argument runs, such groups are less likely to disengage and to violently challenge new institutions. Now, what are the problems with these discourses? The first one, and I'm just going to say very briefly, is that the evidence base for these claims is actually very weak. There's very little empirical research, and some of the key theoretical treatments of it, such as much of the kind of post-liberal state-building discourse that focuses on local ownership, provides at best anecdotal evidence, but no systematic examination of the claims made there. Conceptually, more important though, is that I think it is really blind to the problems of power. Who is empowered by a local ownership agenda? And in particular, the critical state-building literature at times presents the local as a very unproblematic identity juxtaposed to an equally undifferentiated and purposeful international. In particular, in post-conflict environments, local communities can be deeply divided. They encompass different and at times conflicting values and interests. And of course, they relate to each other and to the newly established institutions and to international actors in a range of different ways. So who the actors are that are supposed to exercise ownership is neither obvious nor uncontested. And operationalizing local ownership therefore becomes a highly political exercise that is likely to affect local power structures and political dynamics within a polity, both in intended and unintended ways. The Secretary General's report on peace building, puts a big emphasis on this and highlights how local ownership should work. But I think also highlights the difficulties of the lack of reflection on how to really do this. So the report suggests that, quote, efforts to bolster the power of representative leaders or empower one group at the expense of another can exacerbate the causes of conflict or create new sources of tension. And then it continues, local traditional authorities as well as civil society actors, including marginalized groups, have a critical role to play in bringing multiple voices to the table for early priority setting and to broaden a sense of ownership around the common vision of the country's future. The full participation of women in this process is essential both as victims of the conflict and as important drivers of recovery and development. So a nice sense of continuity, isn't it? Now, how these diverse constituencies and their interests can be reconciled, or how one should choose between them, and according to which criteria, on this the report remains silent. A related issue to this problem of power is the way in which local ownership has been operationalized, and it has often entrenched wartime power structures and inequalities. I think there are four ways through which key state-building policies that have aimed at increasing local ownership have contributed to entrenching existing elites and therefore, in a way, give ownership to just a specific part of a post-conflict polity. The consultation and co-option into governance structures tends to focus on traditional authorities and wartime leaders who are seen as speaking for particular communities. So political settlements, seen as so central to state building in much of the contemporary discourse, are very much elite settlements, and they tend to draw in particular on leading conflict actors. Secondly, the very limited coercive power of international state builders means that they have to rely on co-opting powerful spoilers and potential spoilers into governance structures. I'm happy to give examples for those later in this session. Thirdly, in the absence of effective state institutions, reconstruction aid is often channeled through parallel donor networks into local communities, making established elites the gatekeepers to this aid and empowering them further, exacerbating existing hierarchies. And finally, elections, especially early state-building processes, have tended to entrench wartime elites and legitimate the rule internationally. So why is this a problem for state-building discourse? I think it raises critical questions about the rationales for local ownership. Both the normative rationale, if it only empowers elites and reinforces pre-existing hierarchies and iniquitous social orders, to what extent does it actually further any meaningful self-determination? But also, importantly, the consequentialist rationales for local ownership. If rapacious and venal elites are the key stumbling blocks to state building, as in Haiti in the 1990s, Afghanistan today, or the DRC or in Liberia, how does local ownership that empowers and entrenches them further and gives them a greater voice in the process contribute to more effective state building? There's no obvious reason why their voice in the state building process would either add substantial local knowledge or make institutions more reflective of wider societal values or build local capacity. So it highlights that what one would call emancipatory ownership that empowers the marginalized requires actually quite deep intervention into conflict-affected societies and quite extensive social engineering, which is very much at odds with the underlying spirit of local ownership. To conclude, I just want to finish by saying that on the one hand, operationalizing local ownership is highly political. It requires to think and to act politically, that is, to understand the political economy of institutions and the power dynamics in a country, that is, thinking politically, but also to engage consciously and purposefully with local political processes to shape the political dynamics and empower and give ownership to those otherwise marginalized, which would involve acting politically. On the other hand, though, and here's the paradox of this whole ownership discourse, local ownership is a way for international actors to abdicate their responsibility to think and to act politically. As their commitment, or alleged commitment to local ownership, enables them to disown all the failures of state building as they are now owned by the locals, wherever they are. And on this I should finish.
So I want to talk about democracy, not democracy as understood politically to do with governments and rights, but democracy understood as a social set of processes of transformation. And I think the weirdest thing about state building is how it expresses our sense of the limitation of politics and anything to do with political processes, and how rapidly we begin to express our sense of the exhaustion of politics. And I think I want to talk about the last three presentations. So I think Dominik's presentation is brilliant in terms of how politics and institutional arrangements are really irrelevant to what we call state building, whatever that might be. And the discussions of local ownership the idea that we can have some institutional change and redistribution or sharing of power from the external internationals to the locals, which I think in the 90s was quite fundamental when we had these discussions about sovereignty and interventions being imperialism and all the rest of it. Whereas today we sort of say, well, so what? Even if that happened, what good would that do anyone? There'd still be gender inequalities and exclusions and hierarchies and capitalism and other sorts of problems. And even if we talked a little bit more radically about the inclusion of the excluded voices, of the more marginalised, as Dominik also sort of said, in terms of this extension of local ownership, we say, well, what good would that do? We know that wouldn't really change anything. And it seems that when we talk about politics, we're so disillusioned because it's like we're just sharing out the cake. And basically, for some reason, we're so ultra-radical that all those fundamental questions of politics, which did involve sharing up the cake and distributing the cake through different frameworks of representation and contestation, somehow we're just beyond all that. And we're so beyond it that even in the really problematic societies that are being state-built, we think that politics just isn't going to do it. Now, and so when we talk about democracy as, I want to argue, as a transformative process, I don't think we're talking anything to do with politics and representation. I think that we're imagining this thing about the social power of society and how we unleash it and develop it and empower it and capacity build it. And we understand that as the sort of democracy to come, the democracy that we would aspire to, the democracy that somehow overcomes this political icing on the cake, which is just the same old reproduced in different discourses and different allocations. And the weirdest thing about politics, as Dominik explained it in this old and new and ongoing discourse about local ownership, is that politics isn't transformational. It's like state building has failed, as if we somehow expected it to do whatever it is that it's failed to do. It failed to do it because it's failed to really transform these societies, to bring the social to the surface. And we understand that the transformative possibility of state building can be done through intervention with externals, working with the local community, by somehow freeing and empowering the social. And through that process of socially empowering people, giving people equality of functionality and capacity and autonomy, that's going to be real democracy. That old-fashioned liberal democracy is not the democracy that we're interested in terms of state building. And I think that's a sort of an amazing way that we might understand society. And I think it relates very much to the previous two papers, the problems of the intentions and the unintended consequences, and secondly, the solutions in terms of empowerment, not necessarily just in terms of gender empowerment, but somehow we understand the discourse of the social and empowerment as a solution and a framework of meaning and a framework of intervening, which is going to evade and overcome the problems. Now, the difficulty with the focus on the social rather than the political is, as Gezim brilliantly repeated time and again, is that it's invisible. It's the hidden transcript. It's the hidden, there's something about the social, the hidden transcript of resistance, the hidden transcript of truth, the real base of society, the really marginalised people that need to be empowered and transformed to enable state building to do the things that it couldn't do before. And on one level, we can see it on different ways, but essentially all we really need to see essentially is how the social becomes the focus of our understandings and our transformative hopes. Whereas in the old world, politics was the basis of our transformative hopes for some weird reasons that we might have time to go into. And the thing about seeing the social as the centre of work is that on the one hand, it's a limit. And we talk about that limit all the time. And some of the papers earlier, because that's the whole point of having a collective discussion, it's because we live in the same sort of world. The solution is always there at the bottom of the social, at the local knowledge. And the local knowledge it's always got different levels. And weirdly, the local knowledge we need is always right at the bottom. And the whole discourse of state building has been how we can begin to access that, how we learn that initially the first local knowledge we thought we needed was the old-fashioned political one. Local elites that had representational frameworks, constituencies and communities. Politics understands that as the local knowledge, because it's all about organising, distributing consensuses and all the rest of it. Then we had this civil society type local knowledge. And we're already beginning to get to the transformative aspect there, the stuff that local elites can't do. And then we have this third level, I guess Paul Lederach stuff, which is I think fundamentally important. The third level underneath civil society, the invisible stuff, the stuff that Oliver Richmond wants to look at, the stuff that all the mystics can sell to any peace-building interventionist internationals. How can they get the access to the stuff that isn't actually visible, that isn't organised on the surface? And it's only when we can do that that we can do real transformative work. Now, on one level, that sounds like a blank check for intervention and imperialism and the transformation right to the bottom of anything. Maybe, if you like that sort of conspiracy stuff. On the other level, it's like, these things are a lot more difficult than we thought they were. And us Western liberals, we can sort of handle politics, a bit of negotiation, who's won the elections. But when it comes to the social and understanding that the problems aren't at the institutional level, they're not at the formal level, they're not about, the only thing we ever know is that anything you can see, anything you can count, anything you can vote on, all that politics stuff, that's obviously going to be irrelevant to any sort of way of resolving or improving or transforming something. So when we get into the social stuff, it's not necessarily an invitation for therapeutic social work on a mass basis. It's also a thing that says, now we can begin to understand the limits of state building. Once we understand that the problems are not resolvable at the level of politics, that they're only resolvable at the level of social processes, cognitive frameworks, environmental choice shaping, ideational frameworks, the legacy of the past, however you want to understand the invisible stuff. And the invisible stuff in our minds is just the same as the social. The more inside you go, the less visible and the less measurable it is. So, the way that we pose the invisible and the impossible solution, the democracy that's always to come, as the aspiration, and we can aspire with those endless aspirations once we're entirely distant from anything material and feasible that we could have any responsibility for. The solution is always empowering the people that aren't empowered. And it's not necessarily just a gendered thing, but you can see it already in the gendered stuff. Whoever has the least power, whoever is most excluded from the formal frameworks of the political and the public, weirdly enough, in our reversal of our traditional understandings and our socialization of the political, that's where the solution is. And if only women could be empowered, if only women could have the facilities and the capacities and the cognitive frameworks and represent the world and the society, conflict would be abolished and all the rest of it. And it's not just women, it's any subaltern minority, any excluded group. Because for a state building view, everything is reversed. It's not people with old-fashioned power and representation that are the barrier. They're the political. In the old political world, they would be the barrier. But for state builders, it's always the deepest and most social levels of society. And it's not that they need to be invited at the table in a political framework. It's that their transformation, their empowerment, their engagement in the process, and our engagement as externals in a facilitative process with those depths of society creates a framework, a transformative framework. And the process of empowering, as I don't know, David Harold would say, empowerment rights. When we talk about rights and democracy and empowerment, we're talking about work within the social sphere. We realise that the extension of rights of empowerment, not rights of voting representation, and the extension of capacities and capabilities, and Amartya Sen would say the same thing about development. Development's not about governments and policy making. Development is about freedom and the empowerment and the capability and capacity building of the individual. And we increasingly, we suck the whole of the old-fashioned liberal world that we could measure and understand in liberal frameworks into the social, into social processes. And the role of the external actor is only ever to be amazed at the depth of the social and how it goes down and down and down and down, and to try and agonize about how we might facilitate that. Now, that is also the solution to the unintended consequences thing that gets imposed. Because as long as the West was doing state building, it doesn't do it anymore. We all know that state building is an endogenous process. And what we mean by endogenous is that it's about the social. It's about social processes that reproduce themselves, and that international actors, world capitalism, imperialism, power relations, all that political social stuff, doesn't really have any impact on it. And the whole thing about social processes and endogenous processes is that all we can do is access the social to then understand what we should do. We do not have unintended consequences because the West no longer has intended consequences. The idea that we sat outside politically and did state building by saying, this is our intentions, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to give you local ownership, is an anathema to what we understand as state building today. State building has transformed so quickly that what was like de rigueur and like a nice thing to try and democratise and develop and secure, you know, Western responsibility, country global 90s, that's all seen as the most repressive, imperialist, and not just repressive and imperialist and American biopolitical capitalist neoliberalism, it's also seen as the huge liberal human hubris that someone could just intend things and then do things in the world and in these societies. So what state building says is that we need to access the local knowledge and the metis in order for the intentionality to be generated by society. We need to think about the sustainability and the stability. The social is everything. You can't even develop a set of policies. And that's why every PhD student in the world that does state building always says it's the local knowledge that's the key. It's the access to that local knowledge that will provide the solution, because that will actually give us the intention and the goal. And the goal of democracy as a social process is always an end in itself. It is never ending. Now, we haven't got time to say all the other things I was going to say about how we might understand it. So I'll stop there, because Dominik's quite short as well.
We have about 25 minutes for discussion, maybe a little more, depending. So I open it to the floor.
Thank you, Chandler. Just to clarify, do you mean local, or do you advocate local ownership only in terms of the actual peacebuilding process, or also in terms of the outcome of it, meaning what kind of state structures are supposed to be built?
Let's collect maybe 3, and then.
My question is also for David. It's really yes, sorry. I don't want to say that the local is not important. Of course it's important, but I'm just wondering if all this gesturing and emphasis on the local does not also serve the useful purpose of obscuring the impact that global causes of conflict can have, and more like kind of global patterns of arms trade and everything, all the things that you can think of that are coming not from the inside of the state, but from the outside, that can fuel conflict. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you mean by the social. You say the social is everything, is the basis of our transformative codes. You refer to the depth of the social, the invisible, the impossible, and these terms in relation to this term. I mean, if it's everything, it's nothing, you know, so there's all sorts, so could you be a bit more specific about this concept of the social and how you're distinguishing it from the political? You say, you know, in the old world, politics was the basis of our transformative hopes. Do you mean the ancient, do you mean Greece by the old world? Do you mean pre-Hobbes, and then the social as the basis of our transformative hopes? Do you mean it post-Cuddly 1990s, or do you mean from Locke onwards? How are you referring to the concept of the social there and distinguished as distinct from the political? Thanks.
Okay, I'm taking me order. I don't really advocate local ownership or any other sort of ownership. I'm just investigating different discourses and how they change and what frameworks of understanding are being used. I'm not like a policy person, I don't know about these things. So to me, it's interesting the way that our discourses of the local have been transformed. And today, particularly, the local is always the sphere of resistance. The local is always the barrier. But for some reason, we love that. It's not like they're bad. It's like, hey, this is brilliant. Bring it on. And we love it. We love it so much, the resistance of the local, that now we think that objects and inanimate objects are also resisting us, as Gesim alluded to. And it's like really interesting. Why would we do that? Especially policymakers and governments. They always say there's no means ends, causality stuff, we can't really do these things, even the objects are against us. Everyone is resisting. And that makes the world meaningful to us, in a way. So, Audrey's question about the local, it obscures the world of politics and social relations and imperialism and asymmetries. Well, that world's actually, okay, if we had a microscope or just our eyes, we could see all that world. But in today's world, we don't look at the world like that. We don't even look at it in our own countries. We have economic and social problems, and the government organises broken Britain and broken communities, and how we can get children in schools to have more self-confidence and organise them to have better choice-making capacities, and how even babies, we need to start with the babies and stuff. And it's like, it's the social process of how we develop and empower people in order to transform society. I mean, it would be weird to explain state building and the discursive shifts within state building as somehow to do with state building. I sort of think the shift to the social is we're so embedded in it that we can't think beyond it. And we understand politics and social relations because we have books and stuff, but our minds aren't really in a world where those things have the same meaning, I think. I mean, I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm just saying that's a thing that we need to think about. And what do I mean by the social? I don't mean anything. I'm just talking about how the social is understood and constructed vis-a-vis the political. And it seems that the less the state and politics and representation and communities and sovereignty seem to do the things they did, the social seems to do more. And obviously I could have gone into some different frameworks of how we might explain it, how we might trace it genealogically or whatever. But crudely put, since the end of the Cold War, the most radical political movements in the world seem to have less of an external transformative understanding and more of a social transformative view. Even outside the West, even Lula in Brazil and Latin America, participatory budgeting, transformation takes place through the social transformation of the subject, not through the external growth of the human in relationship to the external world, through science and technology and culture and all that stuff. And it just seems weird that a whole lot of the world has disappeared, and we can still see it in films and in books, just like smoking. It's just, these things change very quickly. So.
I've got a question for both. To Dominik first, I would like to hear more about how you conceive local knowledge, and if we could say that there is sort of a provincial European understanding about what state building is, and whether we can consider that as sort of a form of local knowledge, perhaps exported through state building policies. A bit of sort of perhaps a challenge, but or a weird question, but very interested in how you conceive local knowledge. To David Chandler, well, in a way, isn't this kind of socialization of the political, as you put it, a sort of way of putting policy making in terms of neutrality, but also academic work in terms of social science, and they come across as being policymakers or academics and not straightforward political theorists advocating for a particular mode of governance, production, etc. And just one quick thing. I mean, the focus on resistance, isn't it in a way a sort of a mislinked that was missing perhaps in the 1990s in terms of how the youth ventures were portrayed as too overpowering, too monolithic, too unitary. And so the efforts that have been made to study resistance have provided us a bit more of a sociological, more realistic view of what's going on the ground.
It's a question to both. David, well, I really like both of the presentations, but David, you're talking about this rise of the social, which I really agree with. I do agree with you, but when was it different? When was like it seems that you have a bit of nostalgia maybe of the political process, but when was that process? And if it's not like that, are you not advocating as well for a political process to come? And for Dominik, if we really give importance to the local, how will we discriminate among voices that might perpetuate the conflict?
Thank you.
Sorry, not me. Dominik.
Are we doing another question or?
Let's take the question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I just want to say that something. I don't mean that. I think what you didn't emphasize was that the exhaustion of politics is due to the complete monopoly of capital. Of course, you refer to it, but I think this is something that should be emphasized because global crisis implies that a management of capital must be done at a global level. So economic policies are determined outside and beyond national sovereignty. Therefore, politicians are replaced by experts and elites of international financial capital, as what happened in Italy and Greece. And therefore, democracy in the old sense of the term, not in the sense that David was talking about, is undermined. I agree with that. Because democracy in that sense is only possible at the level of nation state. And so parliamentarianism becomes impotent. But what seems to me is that the only way that the demos can still represent itself or themselves is through street protests. The social that you're talking about, this transformation in the social, I think can't be accomplished by some sort of social engineering. It seems to me you're talking about an oligarchy of transformers. Whereas to me, this can only come about, this new form of transformation can only come about through the agency of, the people, through the mobilization. So we are once more confronted with the old unsolvable question, because your notion of the social seems a little mystical to me. And when you talk about the local, I used to like my old philosophical jargon of particular and universal. And I think that the particular, has to be able to stand for the universal, to create some sort of short circuit with the universal. I don't think the sort of local or particular that you have been talking about can really accomplish that. To me, it just sounds so atomized and, fragmented.
Thank you. Dominik, if you want to take
Sure.
The last one was for David, so I sidestepped that. With regard to how do we discriminate between different voices, that's nothing I do in the context of this project. It really just looks at the kind of conceptual underpinnings and the way the concept is used of local ownership. But sort of put my policy hat on and think, how do we distinguish between different voices? Well, then what we know from for example, Charcot's recent work on inclusive political settlements is that what really meant, in a kind of approach of a kind of consequentialist, so to say, okay, well, we should incorporate those which are relevant voices and which help us to achieve a particular kind of goal, i.e. make a settlement stick. And so you achieve what identified as a kind of fourth rationale of local ownership, that is, give relevant groups a voice and they're involved in the process. And so, well, you give it to all those relevant elites and elites only who participate in the conflict and who could otherwise become spoilers. There's quite strong evidence from both case studies and from large N work that is what offers that inclusive settlements are absolutely, these kind of settlements are absolutely central and have a strong causal relationship with the peace agreement sticking. So that would be my kind of policy answer to that. Does it create questions of justice and other things? It absolutely does, and it doesn't answer those. It doesn't answer those. It's purely to achieve one particular goal. So, with regard to the other question of is state building a form of European local knowledge? Well, but yes, but it's kind of not a particularly interesting issue to explore, because the state, in the sense of the state, that it is fundamentally a European concept. It's a way of organizing. It's a way of organizing power and social relations through a kind of autonomous state institutions, and so it seems to be. It doesn't seem to be particularly surprising that the kind of conceptual underpinnings of this are rooted in European political philosophy and European knowledge and experiences. So the wider question is kind of what is local knowledge that kind of flows from this. Well, it is. I think what makes local knowledge interesting to look at is the way in which local community or different communities perceive particular problems or understand particular concepts. So, does peace or does authority mean the same thing in different contexts? And how these things might differ from. I mean, it's not a particularly, I think, hugely insightful answer as to what I mean by knowledge. I think it's generally conceptualized. Now, does it matter? I think it surely does, in a sense that when different conceptions, when we start to understand things, when local communities start to understand things differently from state builders, let alone whether state builders understand different things very differently, because this in itself is not a kind of homogeneous community. That surely has implications for the way in which you design policies and for the consequences of their policies because of the interactions that follow from it.